Hi there tonight. We step softly into a time long labeled as shadowy murky and not so affectionately dark. But as you step barefoot across the dewy grass just beyond your thatched doorway, a loaf of bread tucked under your arm and the sky starting to pinken with dawn, you begin to wonder, maybe it's not so dark after all. Maybe someone just forgot to open the shutters. Your hut is warm, smoky, and humming with quiet life. The hearth crackles, the bread steams gently from the morning's bake, and a goose is already giving you the side eye from its usual post under the bench. You stretch wince a little your knee again and start your day the way any sensible 8th century soul does, by attempting not to trip over anything on your way outside. You probably won't survive this era without getting mildly scalded, sneakily pickpocketed by your own child, or accused of sorcery for knowing which mushrooms not to eat. Before you fully sink into your pillow, a quick like and subscribe would mean the world if you're into sleepy stories like this. Got a strange bit of history you want to hear before bed? Drop it in the comments. Tuck yourself in, slow your breathing, and let the past keep you company tonight. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step out into a world already awake in its own stubborn, earthy way. There's the sound of a distant handbell, Father Cuthbert again calling the local children for lessons, or maybe calling the chickens. He insists it's the former. The chickens aren't so sure. The village is a tangle of turf-roofed homes, smoke trails rising like lazy ribbons and paths that know more about you than you'd like. You nod to your neighbor. She nods back, carrying a bucket full of turnips in quiet judgment. A dog lopes by with someone's sock, possibly yours. You head toward the market square, not paved, not fenced, but worn smooth by feet and wheels, and one incident with a runaway goat that became legend. Here, in this so-called dark age, life bustles. Children chase one another with sticks repurposed as swords. A man tends to his loom in the open air, humming something tuneless but confident. Bread is traded for cheese, gossip for eggs, promises for wool. You reach the baker's stall. It's more of a bench, really, with an awning stitched from 2 old cloaks and a repurposed cartwheel holding it up. But the bread is warm, soft, smells like an apology for yesterday's weather. You trade a handful of herbs and a wink. The baker blushes. It's unclear which part earned that. Historians still argue whether daily life in early medieval communities was full of hardship or simply full of humility. You suspect the truth is somewhere in the middle, hidden beneath layers of mud routine and the faint smell of pickled onions. Back at your home, the day unwinds into its familiar rhythm, tending the hearth, mending your child's tunic again, listening as your cousin tries to convince you that his new spirit-sniffing dog can predict rain. It cannot. It once predicted a wedding that turned out to be a funeral. No one blamed the dog. They just invited it anyway. You take a moment to rest. Sit on the low stool. Feel the uneven floor beneath your feet. Hear the sounds of the day roll by, the clang of someone hammering copper, the soft bleating of sheep being deeply uncooperative, the hum of bees near the herbs drying in the window. You're not in a dark world. You're in a dim world, candlelit, fire-warmed, shaded by oaks and ruled by seasons. A world where people know the sky better than books, where days begin with bread and end with stories. As twilight slips over the village, the smells change. Stew now instead of porridge. Smoke again, but sweeter. Laughter. Someone's playing a flute. It's not very good, but it's determined. You smile, because this world, your world, might not have street lamps or libraries on every corner, but it has rhythm, color, voices, a bit of unexpected joy wedged between chores. And in the quiet moments when the wind dies down and the stars prick open the sky like candle flame on velvet, you feel it. This place is far from dark. You settle onto your low bench as twilight pulls her shawl across the rooftops, the warm flicker of your hearth glowing in rhythm with your breath. You can't quite read, at least not the books the monks guard like dragon eggs, but you can listen. And tonight you listen as your neighbor's eldest daughter reads aloud from a small, crinkled manuscript, borrowed somewhat grudgingly from the chapel scriptorium. The Latin is slow, deliberate, and occasionally incorrect. She pauses to sound out difficult words, squinting at the faded ink and slightly scorched edges. Someone spilled oil on it years ago. Possibly brother said, possibly the goat. Still, the words survive. And that's the remarkable part. Because in this so-called dark age, people have not stopped reading. They've not stopped writing. They've not even stopped copying what came before, just with slightly colder fingers and far more interruptions involving livestock. Up in the monastery, just a short walk or long trudge away, the scribes work by candlelight. They dip quills into ink made from crushed gall and iron salts, painstakingly tracing letters onto vellum, turning animal skin into scripture science and scribbled commentary. You visited once. They let you peek under supervision, of course, at a shelf of volumes, each wrapped in cloth like a treasured relic. One was a Roman text, something about geometry. The margins were filled with doodles, birds wearing shoes, a knight jousting a snail and a cat, fighting what might have been a musical fish. You're told the monks add these when the copying gets boring, which is often. Still, they do it. Page after page. Preserving not just holy texts, but classical knowledge, Pliny, Cicero, Galen. The words are ancient, but the parchment is fresh. And it's not just monks. Travelers carry scraps of poems sewn into hymns. Merchants quote proverbs half-remembered from schoolrooms. A widow in the next village recites old charms so precisely you wonder if she's part owl. Historians still argue whether literacy in this era was elite only or surprisingly widespread, whether learning was cloistered behind stone walls or meandering down village lanes dressed in riddles and rhyme. You suspect it depends on where you're standing. In your village, the chapel bell doesn't just call for prayer, it calls for lessons. Father said teaches reading to anyone willing to stay awake. Children with straw in their hair and dirt under their nails copy runes onto birch bark. Older students practice with charcoal on flat stones. You've seen your own child carefully etching their name on a plank of wood tongue sticking out, concentrating harder than they do when climbing trees. In that same chapel, tucked behind the altar, is a tiny cupboard with scrolls too old to open casually. Their edges crumble. Their writing leans at odd angles, but the monks preserve them, murmuring over them as if they're listening to ghosts. Some days you sit outside the scriptorium and just listen to the scratching. Quill on vellum. A quiet, rhythmic song of survival. Because even when the roads are muddy, the crops uncertain, and the kings forget your name, someone is still writing, still remembering. There's a story about a blind monk who could recite entire psalters. Another about a nun who composed hymns in her sleep, though one turned out to be about cheese. No one minded. You recall the time the village reeve tried to learn Latin phrases to impress a visiting noble. He said Ave Porcus with great pride. He meant, greetings, Lord. He actually said, hello, pig. The noble didn't notice. The pig did. But oh, how those words matter. Written or spoken, copied, or carved into doorframes, language lives. You've scratched names into wood. You've sung songs older than your grandmother's spoon. You've whispered lullabies that once helped Rome's children sleep. Your world isn't mute. It's murmuring, softly, steadily, in every pen stroke, every chant, every doodle of a cat playing the harp in the margins of a saint's life. The Dark Ages remind you nothing is truly forgotten if it's remembered together. You listen as your neighbor finishes the reading. She stumbles on the last word. Everyone applauds anyway, and you smile into the firelight. Because even when the parchment is wrinkled, the ink smudged the Latin wobbly, the words shine bright enough to read by. You wander out past the edge of the fields today, further than usual, past the willow trees and the sleepy brook, where the air smells less like goats and more like possibility. You're headed toward the old road, what the elders call the stone string, a Roman track still visible in some places like a fossil of civilization, long since buried but never quite forgotten. Along the way, you pass a shepherd humming to himself in the rhythm of poetry, except he's not quoting scripture and it's definitely not Latin. It's something else, something softer, familiar. You realize with a slow smile that he's singing in the local tongue, your tongue. And that changes everything. In a world where Latin ruled the scrolls and sermons here in your corner of Britain, people have begun writing and singing in the language of everyday life. The vernacular. At first, it was just oral passed hand to hand, like bread kneaded into memory and rolled in rhyme. But now people are writing it down in English, in Old High German, in Old Welsh and Norse, and anything else that'll stick to a parchment and survive goat interference. You remember the Reeves' youngest daughter scribbling a poem on the wall with charcoal. Something about a squirrel with a grudge. It wasn't long, it wasn't elegant, but it was hers. And it was written not in the lofty language of saints and emperors, but in the same voice she used to argue about apples. That matters. You pause beside a low stone wall and scratch a few letters into the mossy corner. Your name, your child's. A word you made up to describe the sound mud makes when you step in it sideways. It's not official, but it is language. In the next village over, someone's translating Psalms into Anglo-Saxon. Not to replace the Latin, but to let the shepherds and milkmaids hear their own words echoed in holy tones. And the minstrels, oh, they fully committed. They sing of love and farming, and the one time a sheep learned to open a gate. And they sing it in your voice, not to scholars, not to monks, but yours. Historians still argue whether the rise of vernacular writing signals the decline of classical learning or the birth of a new kind of literacy. Whether it meant elegance lost or understanding gained. You shrug. It feels like breathing. You remember when Brother Ted let your child write out a proverb phonetically? It was barely readable, full of backward letters and enthusiastic guesses, but he praised it like scripture. Language, he said, isn't just a system, it's a shared story. You smile now, remembering that, as you watch a trader pull his cart down the old road. He's singing too. A northern dialect you can half follow. Something about a bad harvest and a talking chicken. You nod politely. The chicken in question is probably still alive. You step over the old Roman paving stones. The road is uneven. Some stones are cracked, sunken, half swallowed by the earth. But it still leads somewhere, just like the words you've written, just like your language. Once you saw a child teaching her grandmother how to write her name, oh, she traced it slowly, proudly onto a scrap of leather. 4 crooked letters. The grandmother wept. Not because the letters were perfect, but because they were hers. That night, by firelight, you opened the little box of precious things, dried herbs, a polished stone, a strip of linen inked with a lullaby in your own hand. It's not neat, it's not Latin, but it's yours. You whisper the words aloud and they curl around the rafters like smoke, like warmth, like proof. Your world isn't silent, and it isn't dark. It's just learning to sing in its own voice. The thatcher is already halfway up your roof by the time you return from the stream, muttering to himself and poking the old straw with the stick that doubles as a measuring rod, goat deterrent, and occasional percussion instrument. You offer him a nod and a loaf of yesterday's bread. He accepts both bites. The loaf, frowns thoughtfully, and says, "Bit damp, like your eaves." It's hard to argue with a man whose entire job is preventing your family from waking up damp. You settle nearby on a low stool ostensibly to help, but mostly to learn. Because roof thatching in your time is no small thing. It's equal parts craft survival and communal theater. And if the roof collapses in the middle of winter again, you'd prefer to know how to yell at it constructively. The thatcher hums while he works weaving reed and straw into neat, overlapping bundles, tying them down with lengths of rope that once held together something you vaguely remember being a fence. He explains that proper thatch is like a good stew layered firm and unlikely to kill you. You learn as you watch, and you remember that this isn't just repair, it's architecture. In Dark Age Britain, buildings are handcrafted honed from the materials nearest at hand. Wattle and daub walls, timber frames, sod roofs where goats occasionally sunbathe and monks occasionally slip. Your own home has stood for 30 winters, maybe more. Its beams are dark with smoke and stories, and its floor slants subtly to the left because of the year the pig dug a surprise tunnel. You fixed it 5 times. The slant stays. It's tradition now. Behind your hut, you've helped your cousin raise a new granary wooden post, sunk deep floors raised high to keep the grain safe from rat's rot and that one incredibly motivated chicken. It creaks like an old man, but it's sturdy. You're proud of it. And in the next village over a hall is being built. Massive beams hoisted into place with ropes and muscle its skeleton, rising like the rib cage of a sleeping beast. You visited last week just to gawk. They let you lift a beam. You dropped it on your foot. This bruise is still there, but so is your sense of awe. Historians still argue whether early medieval architecture was advanced or basic. But from where you sit watching a man bend physics to keep the rain out, you'd say it's both. It's ingenious, it's resilient, and it's built with hands that know wood like a baker knows dough. You help the thatcher press a new bundle into place. He shows you how to stagger the layers, how to tuck them just so. You mess it up once. He grunts. You try again. Later, the sun finds your roof and warms it just enough that you can smell the hay curing into weatherproof poetry. In the corner of the village, someone's repairing a fence with planks from an old cart. Next to them, a woman is plastering a wall with a mix of clay straw and something she claims is goose essence. You don't ask. Your child-inspired builds a hut of their own with sticks, mud, and fierce declarations. It collapses twice. The third time it holds. They cheer. You do too. Because this bending of the world into shelter is sacred work. You end the day gathering moss for insulation, tucking it into cracks and corners, humming the thatcher's tune as you go. When the wind picks up later that night, you lie under your roof and listen. No drips, no creaks, just the soft breath of a house that remembers how it was made. And who made it? You know something's up the moment you open the door and catch a whiff of rosemary goose fat and what can only be described as aggressively boiled onion. You wrinkle your nose. Someone somewhere is making a remedy, possibly for cough, possibly for heartbreak, possibly both. You follow the smell. It leads you past the smithy where someone's hammering metal like it owes them rent, and into the yard of the village healer, an elderly woman with sharp eyes, dirt-caked hands, and an apron that could legally be classified as a botanical archive. She doesn't look up as you approach. She's too busy mashing something green and slimy with a pestle that's seen better centuries. Shoulder again, she asks without glancing. You nod. She points at a stool. You sit. The air inside her hut is thick with steam, dried herbs, and the kind of energy that makes bees nervous. She rubs a thick salve into your shoulder, something involving goose grease yarrow, and a prayer muttered under her breath in a language older than the thatched roof. It tingles, then it burns, then it cools. You don't question the order. This is medicine in your time. Not sterile, not standardized, but alive. Made with care, passed down in rhyme, and sometimes involving ingredients like crushed beetle shell or powdered unicorn horn. Actually, just deer antler, but the marketing is excellent. She gives you a pouch of dried herbs. For teas, she says. Or dreams. You're not sure if that's a warning or an invitation. You thank her and return home, your shoulder humming like a well-fed bee. Historians still argue whether medieval medicine was useful or mostly superstition wrapped in sheep bladders. You know it's both. Because when your child had a fever last year, it was the same healer who sat up all night beside them, muttering chants and cooling their brow with moss soaked in vinegar. The fever broke. The moss was composted. The child now insists it gave them the power to see in the dark. You don't correct them. At the market, there are apothecaries with baskets of dried foxglove nettle and plants with names like Bishop's Bane or Old Man's Comfort. You once bought a love charm made of mint and beeswax. It smelled nice. Your spouse found it under your pillow and laughed for 10 straight minutes. Every household has a few remedies of its own. Your neighbor swears by boiled horseradish wrapped in linen for sore throats. Your cousin insists on a garlic poultice for everything from chest coughs to cursed chickens. There's even a monk nearby who collects medical texts, heavy books filled with diagrams of human anatomy drawn by people who clearly hadn't met many humans. One of the texts suggests burying a toad under your threshold to ward off toothaches. You haven't tried it. Yet. You recall a time you stepped on a sharp stone and bled all over your best boots. The healer burned a bit of wool, mixed the ash with honey, and packed it into the wound. It healed. The boots didn't. You rubbed the salve into your shoulder again that evening. It smells slightly less herbal now, more smoky like a garden, and a bonfire had a quiet argument and compromised. You glance at the small pouch. You brew a tea. It's bitter thick and tastes vaguely like a disagreement between celery and despair. But afterward you sleep so deeply that not even the goat's snoring can wake you. And that in the end is all the diagnosis you need. Because here medicine is a mix of nature, habit, instinct, and a good story. It's a charm tucked in a sleeve, a word whispered to the wind, a prayer pinned to the edge of a wound. It's not perfect, but neither are you. And yet you keep going. Because someone knew which leaf to crush, and someone else remembered why. The wind shifts just after dawn, carrying with it the distinct scent of something fried and possibly fish-based, though in this light it could also be turnip-related. You sniff the air and realize market day. You grab your satchel filled with modest goods, 2 eggs, a heel of cheese, a carved spoon, and a bundle of dried herbs your neighbor swears is exceptionally lucky. You also throw in a bit of gossip for good measure. In the market, information is as tradable as onions. You follow the stream path boot squelching softly through last week's rain until the trees part and the sounds of haggling bleating and one very determined lute player flood your ears. The market is awake. It sprawls like an unmade bed blankets, laid out in lumps, baskets overflowing with roots and linen, a goat chewing on something that may once have been a hat. Traders from nearby villages set up stalls that lean suspiciously while local sellers lounge behind goods displayed with varying degrees of ambition. You trade your spoon for a small sack of salt. It's coarse and slightly damp, but it glitters in the light, and that's something. Next, you haggle over a dried fish. The seller insists it's fresh. You raise an eyebrow. He offers to throw in a clove of garlic and a blessing from St. Aelred. You accept. And then from a booth cloaked in woven cloth and incense, you hear someone whisper, "Frankincense from the east." You pause. That's not a phrase you hear every day. The woman behind the stall is missing 2 teeth and has a voice like folded parchment. She lays out her wares resins, spices a scrap of silk that smells like camel and ambition. From the coast, she says. Traded through Francia. Brought by boat. Carried by men who've never worn socks. You don't have much to trade, but you ask for a story. She leans in. There's a city, she says, where the streets are lined with shade and water runs in carved channels beside every doorway. They drink sweet milk cooled in jars beneath the earth, and the people wear blue cloth so fine it sings in the breeze. You trade her the eggs. Historians still argue how extensive Dark Age trade networks really were. Did people in Britain truly access goods from Byzantium North Africa, even the Silk Roads? Or were those just travelers' tales fattened on ale and ambition? The answer sits in your satchel beside the salt and garlic and damp cheese is a small cone of incense that smells like a distant temple. You move along nodding at a bard juggling apples badly, and a monk selling ink-stained scraps of parchment with verses half-copied from an older book. You buy one. It says roughly translated, "Fear not the wind, for it is only a breath too big." You pass the cloth merchant who's folded his wool into stiff stacks that look more like seating than shirts. He offers you a smock dyed with woad. It's blue enough to startle bees. You decline. Blue is not your color. You exchange gossip for a spindle. Trade a story about your cousin's haunted oven for a chunk of beeswax. Give a riddle in return for a sweet cake that tastes like boiled dreams. And all around you trade buzzes. Not just in goods, but in ideas. There's talk of a new plowing technique, of a king on the continent who drinks wine from silver cups and writes his own laws, of a woman healer in the south who uses pressed herbs wrapped in linen and charges by how dramatic the patient is. News flows through the market like a second wind, carried in laughter and song and whispered bets about which goat will escape next. It's always Oswin's. You linger at the edge of the square as the sun climbs higher. Children chase one another with bread crusts. An elder sits in the shade carving birds into wood and humming something wordless. Someone starts a slow dance. No one joins, but they keep dancing anyway. Trade here is never just about wealth. It's about connection. You return home with salt garlic, a sweet cake, a parchment scrap, a slightly singed ribbon, and the scent of incense clinging to your sleeves. As you unpack, your spouse inspects the haul. "This is fish," they ask. You shrug, mostly. They nod. Fair enough. Later that night, you light the incense just a pinch and watch the smoke spiral up toward the beams, carrying with it the scent of 1,000 miles and a reminder, even in the dark, people reached out, bartered, shared, traveled, dreamed. You wake to the sound of bells, soft, uneven, carried on the wind, like an old hymn sung half in sleep. It's the chapel bell, and it tolls with the slow rhythm of Sunday, or at least what counts for it in a world without printed calendars or synchronized anything. You roll out of bed, wrap yourself in your cloak, and follow the sound. The chapel is a low stone building with a roof that's perpetually concerned about its own stability. Moss grows in the mortar. Birds nest in the beams. The door creaks like an old man who's heard too many secrets. Inside, Brother Set is already lighting the candles. He smiles at you softly like someone who's spoken too many words this week and is now rationing them. You nod back and find your spot on the bench, trying not to sit on the carved warning about frogs. The room fills slowly, neighbors in wool cloaks, children who can't sit still, elders who don't need to. There's a goat outside who wants in, but this time the latch is holding. Said begins. He speaks in Latin, mostly with occasional glances toward the local dialect when he feels his audience drifting into dreams or porridge-based reverie. He talks of grace, of charity, of patience. He forgets where he is halfway through and accidentally quotes a line from a poem about bread. No one minds, because this is more than ritual. It's rhythm. You glance at the walls. Faded frescoes, angels with wonky wings, saints with suspiciously familiar faces. You're fairly sure one of them is the local blacksmith, depicted with a halo and a hammer. And then in a quiet moment, your eyes drift to the corner shelf. Books, wrapped in linen, tucked carefully out of reach of candle flame and curious toddlers. One of them, contains more than prayers. It holds a calendar not just of feasts and fasts, but of planting days, lunar shifts, medicinal herbs in season. It's the village's unofficial almanac scribbled in the margins by 3 generations of monks and one very opinionated nun. After the service, Said invites you to see it. The binding crackles as he opens it. You see pages of cramped Latin script decorated with vine stars and once memorably a tiny donkey with a crown. There are lists of saints, yes, but also notes on weather births, deaths, strange dreams, and a warning about eating cheese on Thursdays. This one, he says, tapping a page is about midsummer. See the margin. That's where we added the part about onions. You squint. Sure enough, next to the Feast of St. John, also a good day for roasting onions in the ground, with salt. You nod respectfully. St. John and onions, a holy pairing. Historians still argue whether early Christianity erased or blended with the old pagan ways. But here, under this mossy roof, it's less of a debate and more of a dinner party. Said blesses the fields with words older than Latin. The elder midwife swears by St. Bridget and also by leaving milk at the crossroads. Your neighbor carries a carved charm wrapped in a ribbon just for luck, even as she kneels to pray for rain. And every spring someone paints eggs red and buries them near the roots of the oldest tree. No one explains it. No one stops it. Faith here is layered like a thatched roof. Christian saints woven through older spirits' blessings, tucked into the folds of rituals that remember being something else. You once watched Said sing a psalm over a sick cow. The next day, the cow recovered, gave birth to twins, and now refuses to leave the chapel steps. You don't question miracles. As you leave the chapel, the wind catches your cloak, and the bell rings again, once sharp and clear. You look back and see Said waving. He's holding a sprig of rosemary in one hand and a loaf of bread in the other. Balance, you think. That's what holds this world together. Not dogma, not decree, but the quiet way a prayer can sit beside a charm, how a saint's day can guide a farmer's hand, how the light through stained glass lands on both gospel and goose. You walk home slowly, letting the bells fade. The goat has gotten in anyway. Of course it has. But your heart is steady, your spirit calm, and somewhere tucked in your sleeve is a folded scrap of parchment with a feast day and a recipe. You'll light a candle tonight, say a word to the sky, and maybe leave out a slice of onion bread for whoever's watching. There's a commotion in the lane this morning. A gentle one, more bleeding than brawling, more confusion than crisis. You peer through the slats in your shutter and spot 3 sheep, 1 cart, and a very flustered reeve trying to coax a goose off his head with the dignity of a man who knows he will never live this down. It must be audit day. Not the taxing kind, though. Coins are involved, but the kind where the reeve counts things. Pigs, people, portions of barley. Also, inexplicably, the number of usable spoons. You've learned not to ask. You step outside, nod to the reeve. He nods back, the goose still firmly affixed, and prepare for your yearly declaration of holdings debts and livestock with boundary issues. This, in a world without spreadsheets or filing cabinets, is record-keeping at its most rustic. Your homestead is technically part of a manor, a patch of land overseen by a thegn or a lord or someone who once beat a Viking in a wrestling match and now insists he deserves rent. You don't own your land in the sense a merchant owns a bolt of cloth. You occupy it, you work it, you defend it from sheep raids, and in exchange you pay dues. Barley, flax, labor. Some years it's more. Some years it's mysteriously less, especially if the reeve gets distracted by a particularly charismatic duck. This morning you hand over a jug of ale and 2 cured fish wrapped in clean cloth. You explain that the 3rd fish didn't make it. The reeve sniffs the cloth, nods, and makes a mark on a wooden tally stick. That's the thing about local governance here. Tally sticks oral memory, the occasional scrawled parchment when the clerk is feeling ambitious. Everything is remembered through habit and repetition. You recall when your cousin disputed a fence. 5 people came forward to testify. 3 drew diagrams in the mud. One mimed the movement of the cow that allegedly pushed the fence post. The case was settled with a handshake and a slightly wobbly song about hedges. Historians still argue whether manorial systems were strict legal frameworks or just social contracts performed enthusiastically in public. You'd argue both, especially when the contract involves ale. This afternoon, the steward arrives. He's better dressed, worse tempered, and has an astonishing mustache that twitches when he's annoyed. He inspects the fields, mutters about yields, and suggests building a second grain store. Everyone nods. No one intends to build it. Then he brings out the charter, a curled piece of vellum with ink that shimmers when the light hits just right. It's full of names, land boundaries, and clauses about fish ponds. You stare politely as though it makes perfect sense. The steward reads it aloud. Slowly. You fall asleep standing up for a moment. But eventually the point becomes clear, the manor's boundaries are reaffirmed, the obligations continue, and you'll need to contribute to repairing the bridge. Again. Back in your hut, you sigh and set aside the coins you'll never see. But there's a strange comfort in the ritual, in the way people gather, in how disputes are heard, even if they're occasionally solved by comparing bite marks. And you're not powerless. You've seen women speak at moot courts and win. You've seen a boy demand compensation for a trampled cabbage and get it in eggs, no less. Your voice may not echo through castle halls, but it matters here. So when a new rule arrives from the king or the church or someone named Alric the Moderate, you discuss it. You mutter, you adjust. Because governance in your world is a mix of written decree and lived negotiation. You know the line between rule and suggestion is often walked by the person with the most goats. As the sun sets, the reeve tallies his last goose. The steward tucks away his charter. You light a lamp, tuck your child into bed, and whisper a story about the time a sheep was elected village watchman. He wasn't good at it, but he was loved. And that's half of ruling, isn't it? Being known, being counted. Even if you're only counted for your spoons, you're on your hands and knees trying to coax a spindle out from under a bench when you hear the unmistakable snap of thread and the even more unmistakable sound of someone swearing in a way that's both creative and entirely unrepeatable around small children. You sit up, bump your head, and peer over the woven curtain. Into the workroom, your spouse is glaring at a pile of tangled wool like it owes them rent. The spindle rolls free and bumps your toe as if sheepishly apologizing. It's weaving day, which honestly is most days, because in your house, as in most houses, textiles aren't a hobby, they're survival. Your cloak, your tunic, your child's lopsided hat all began as raw wool, or flax-soaked, combed, spun, dyed, woven, and sewn by someone with the patience of a saint and the fingers of a magician. And 9 times out of 10, that magician is a woman. You watch as your spouse lifts the loom bar again, muscles flexing with a rhythm you've come to recognize, steady, sure, and slightly dangerous if interrupted mid-row. She works with wool she spun herself. Dyed it, too, using onion skins and woad, and a very long afternoon involving elderberry juice and what you now know was not the correct kind of pot. Her fingers move fast. The thread glides in and out, and the pattern grows simple geometric with the occasional flourish that looks suspiciously like your goat's head. You don't ask. Historians often overlook the scene, overlook her. But here the women run the world. Quietly. With looms instead of lances. With baskets instead of banners. She doesn't need a title. She has a ledger in her head. Who owes flour, who borrowed wool, who returned that cloak with the mysterious burn mark. She makes healing salves, sings the old lullabies, knows how to birth a calf and settle a dispute and calculate exactly how many eggs you owe the baker based on last week's loaf share. And she's not alone. Your neighbor, a widow with 2 grown sons and a herd of sheep, ran last winter's moot when the reeve lost his voice and tried to communicate solely through whistling. She resolved a pig theft, a land disagreement, and a broken engagement, all before lunch. You once watched a group of village women out-argue a visiting merchant over the price of salt, using nothing but raised eyebrows and strategic silence. He left with less salt and more humility. In the next village over, there's an abbess who oversees more land than the local then and writes letters in 4 languages. The bishop refers to her as mother, and not entirely in jest. And then there's the midwife, a woman so revered that people leave her small offerings, bread herbs coins with no face left just for the chance she might pass by their house and bless it with her presence, or more often her glare. She delivered your child with one hand and stirred soup with the other. Your child screamed less than you did. Historians still argue how much power medieval women really held. But you don't need a charter to know who keeps the walls patched, the fire lit, the arguments settled, the stories told, and the clothes dried, despite weather that can only be described as emotionally unstable. You look back at the loom. The cloth now stretches down to the floor, golden brown and blue sturdy as stone, soft as a song. Your spouse ties off the end, sits back, and exhales. You applaud, quietly. She grins. Then she points to the spindle still lying by your foot. Wind that she says, neatly. You obey. Because when she speaks, you listen. Not because you must, but because you're smart. Because you've seen her spin chaos into order, wool into warmth, silence into strength. And you know the truth, even if no one writes it down. The world is woven by women. And if you're lucky, you get to help untangle the threads. The smell hits you first, rich, earthy, comforting, and just slightly singed. A bubbling pot over an open hearth, the hiss of something being turned with a wooden spoon, and a voice humming in a key known only to those who cook with one eye on the fire and the other on the door. It's mealtime. Not a feast, not a famine, just the dependable clatter and sizzle of another meal made from what's on hand, what's in season, and what hasn't been stolen by the chickens yet. You dip your ladle into the stew and taste cautiously. Turnips, barley, a bit of wild onion, possibly a dried mushroom from last autumn, possibly a pebble that looks like one. You chew. It's the mushroom, you think? There's no menu here, no courses, no sauces named after dukes. But there is flavor. The kind that builds slowly from hours over a fire and spices traded for in distant markets and hoarded like treasure. Salt, yes, but also sage mustard seed fennel. You once met a traveling monk who offered you a pinch of cinnamon in exchange for lodging. You used it to flavor a winter feast, and the entire village talked about it for a month. You cook with lard when you have it, butter when you're feeling fancy, goat's milk occasionally if you can distract the goat long enough to milk it. Bread is a daily constant. Flat dark baked on stones or risen just enough to be sliced when company visits. The baker once made a loaf shaped like a fish to impress a pilgrim. It collapsed, but the gesture lingered. You set the table a plank across 2 stools of cloth that's seen more stains than sun, and bowls carved from wood that tells their own stories in knots and grooves. Your spouse adds a bowl of pickled cabbage. Your child attempts to sneak a piece of cheese off the plate. You pretend not to see. The cheese is hard-earned, traded for eggs salted, aged, and defended from mice with the kind of intensity usually reserved for inheritance disputes. You remember when that same child tried to churn butter and ended up with something that was neither butter nor memory? You still bring it up on their birthday. There's no cutlery for everyone, just knives and fingers and maybe a communal spoon with the handle chewed by what you hope was a dog. Still, there's etiquette. You don't grab. You dip your bread, not your elbow. You don't speak ill of the stew until the cook has left the room. And you never ever touch the last piece of smoked fish without asking. That's how arguments start. Historians often assume meals were monotonous, bland, functional. But you know better. Meals here are texture, connection, a moment to pause between storms. You eat with family friends, neighbors who wander in just to say hello and leave with full bellies and half a story. Every meal has a story. The eel caught upstream with a broken net and too much optimism. The berries gathered at the edge of the wood where the owls mutter warnings. The pie baked with pears no one admitted were half fermented. And dessert, if you're lucky honeyed oats. If you're truly blessed dried apples soaked in ale, your cousin once tried to invent a pudding using boiled acorns. It tasted like betrayal. You don't talk about it. After the meal, everyone lingers. Not because the food is fancy, but because it's enough. Because the fire is warm. Because the spoon still circles the pot, coaxing out one last bite, one last sip, one last moment before the day tightens its laces again. You wipe your mouth on your sleeve because napkins are for nobles and lean back. You are full, not just in belly, but in bone. Because this meal, this quiet, this laughter over uneven bowls is nourishment in its truest form. No silver, no ceremony, just stew and song, and the taste of being home. You wake in a bed that creaks like an old memory stretch under the scratchy wool blanket, and hear the sound of too many people trying to do too many things in too small a space. You're not in your village anymore. You're in the town, and the town, unlike home, does not sleep in. You pull on your cloak, tuck your purse under your tunic, and step out into a lane paved more with puddles than promise. The air smells of smoke, sweat, spices, and somewhere distinctly warm ale and wet dog. Welcome to urban life in the so-called Dark Ages. An accidental orchestra of chimney smoke bell towers, and someone yelling about turnips with the urgency of a man who's seen war. This is no Roman metropolis, but it's no sleepy hamlet either. The town is growing awkwardly unevenly like a teenager who's inherited 3 pairs of shoes and none of them fit. Streets twist, houses lean, and every other doorway is a workshop bakery or someone claiming to be a barber, apothecary, and locksmith all at once. You walk past a row of stalls selling cloth dyed in uneven shades of saffron, a barrel organ played with great determination but little skill, and a pair of boys attempting to race ducks for coin. One duck refuses. The other has wandered into a tannery. You buy a pair with one soft side. It's perfect. In the square, the guild hall rises in half-timbered grandeur. Not everyone here is a freeman, but trade is a golden ticket. Bakers, brewers, weavers, and metal workers form guilds protecting their secrets, setting prices ensuring no one sells underweight bread unless they want a quiet but forceful talk from a man named Alric with suspiciously large elbows. You stop to listen to a town crier. He stands on a barrel waving a scroll that might be official and might be his laundry list. Hear ye, he shouts, new laws from the king. Everyone groans. Taxes adjusted, pigs exempt. Everyone cheers. Historians still argue how sophisticated these towns really were. Some say they were just overgrown villages with plumbing issues. Others see the early seeds of modern urban life, commerce, governance, noise complaints. You feel both. A scribe walks past muttering about missing ink and social respect. A beggar follows shaking a cup with a clink that speaks of copper and sympathy. You duck into a narrow alley. Shortcuts here are part myth, part map, and part dare. You pass 2 cats, a mural of St. George painted mostly in soot, and a shoemaker hammering nails into something that was a shoe and might now be art. You reach the tavern by smell alone. Inside it's chaos, but structured chaos. People shout orders and gossip in the same breath. A man argues about wool tariffs with a woman who clearly just wanted her soup. A musician in the corner plays a lute with more feeling than accuracy. You find a bench, sip something that might be beer and might be broth, and listen. Stories spill here like ale. A sailor swears he saw a whale with antlers. A merchant claims his boots were blessed by a saint and now he never blisters. A young man declares he's in love with the baker's daughter. She rolls her eyes from the other corner and mouths third this week. Evening falls and the town glows. Candles flicker in windows. A procession of children chase a cart carrying firewood and shrieking like wolves. You wander back toward your lodging, pausing to watch a dispute unfold over who owns a particularly smug-looking goose. The constable resolves it with a coin flip and a warning: if it poops on your stoop, it's yours. And as you climb the creaky stairs to your borrowed bed, you think, this place is loud. It's crowded. It's strange and slightly smelly. But it's also alive. Not dark. Not backward. Just busy and trying its best. Like everyone else. The light slants just so through the chapel window this morning, catching a glint of gold in the corner of a dusty book. You're there early, helping Brother Said tidy the scriptorium, though helping might be a generous term for what mostly involves you trying not to knock over anything older than your grandmother's walking stick. You lean closer to the glint and see it tiny figures painted in the margins, their robes glittering with painstakingly applied gold leaf. One's a lion with spectacles, another a monk asleep at his desk, snoring onto a parchment full of psalms. It's an illuminated manuscript, and it's ridiculous, and beautiful, and utterly human. Brother Said chuckles when he sees your expression. The scribes get bored, he says, with the long-suffering tone of someone who's both copied books and tried to discipline artists who spend more time drawing rabbits in armor than transcribing Leviticus. But that's the thing, isn't it? The so-called Dark Ages didn't forget how to make beauty, they just learned to hide it in the corners of books. You turn the page. A saint with luminous blue eyes stares out. Above his head, a speech bubble, yes, really reads Fiat Voluntas Tua. Your Latin's a bit shaky, but you're fairly sure it means, let your will be done. Below him, someone's drawn a smiling snail in armor, jousting with a chicken. Said points, that's Saint Brictius, or possibly Gerald. The scribe got distracted. These books take months to complete. Years sometimes. Each letter drawn by hand. Each page painted with a squirrel hairbrush. Every illuminated capital exploding with vines, beasts, stars, and the occasional monk riding a fish. Historians still debate whether these marginalia served a spiritual purpose or were just medieval doodles born of sore backs and too much ink. Said insists it's both. When you stare at God's word for 10 hours straight, he says sometimes a dancing bear just happens. You believe him. Some margins hold prayers. Others recipes. One particularly weathered book contains a diagram of a wheel of cheese labeled Divine Geometry. You're not sure if it's symbolic or just hungry work. The monks know these books are treasures even when the outer world calls them nonsense. They're copied from Roman originals, Irish Gospels, Greek treatises reinterpreted, reimagined, and redrawn to reflect a world of dim light, bright faith, and the urge to draw rude pigs in sacred texts. You watch one monk sharpening a quill. Another mixes ink from oak galls vinegar and iron salts. His fingers are stained a deep blue-black, like he's permanently been caught holding the truth. The smell of parchment and candle wax settles around you. The quiet isn't silent, it's filled with small sounds. The scrape of quill on skin, the sigh of someone rereading a smudged word, the soft hum of a hymn, half remembered. Outside the village trudges on children, shouting, a dog barking at a suspicious leaf, a farmer loudly announcing that his cart is stuck again. Inside, time slows. You touch the page carefully, reverently. The gold is warm from the sun. The ink, still vivid centuries later, curls in a shape so precise it makes your chest ache. You think about the hands that made this. Hands that tended fires, sheared sheep, buried friends. Hands that still found time to draw a cat dancing in the corner just because it felt right. And that's the truth of it. The Dark Ages weren't dull or mute. They were full of life quietly stashed between pages, written in margins, whispered in colors. You leave the scriptorium with ink-smudged fingertips and a smile. And that night when your child asks for a bedtime story, you tell them about the knighted snail, the holy cheese, and the monk who tried to teach a goose Latin. They laugh until they hiccup. You tuck them in with the blanket woven from wool dyed with onion skins and old prayers. And as the fire dies down, you think, maybe beauty lives best when it has to sneak in the back door. Maybe joy is sacred too, even when it's drawn in the corner of a page. You wake before the rooster, an accident you plan not to repeat, and step outside to a world still wrapped in mist. The fields stretch out pale and quiet beneath the sky the color of old wool. You sniff the air and catch the faintest hint of damp earth and slow-growing things. It's a farming day. Then again, every day is a farming day here. Even rest days come with someone whispering about weeding or a chicken looking suspiciously industrious. You grab your hoe, your hat more for confidence than shade, and trudge toward the fields. The soil here has known your family for generations. It knows your footsteps, your muttering, and the way you always forget your gloves. You test its dampness by touch, not too wet, not too dry, just willing enough to forgive yesterday's hoeing. Today you plant. Broad beans, the kind that will sprout quick and strong if the crows don't stage another siege. Turnips, of course, vital, stubborn, and capable of surviving both frost and your cousin's cooking. And onions, because life needs flavor and someone always has a cold. You work by rhythm, dig, drop, pat, move. Your child helps, sort of. They mostly dig holes in the wrong places and narrate their imaginary farming empire, which includes unicorns and attacks on misbehaving sheep. You let them. As you plant, you glance upward. The moon is just visible, pale, thin, watching. Your neighbor insists it's a good omen. Waxing crescent, she says. Good for growth. She also believes planting beans upside down encourages humility. You do it anyway. Can't hurt. You know the old calendar by heart, though, not the kind with saints and fasts. Yours is older. Built from frost, dates first sprouts, bird calls, and when the cows start mooing in their sleep. Historians still argue whether early medieval farmers relied on Roman texts or folk tradition. The truth is, you rely on both. Brother said once read you a Latin manual on grafting. You understood half. Still, your grafted apple tree has survived 3 winters and once produced a fruit shaped exactly like your uncle's nose. It's become a local legend. You pause for water and watch the morning mist lift from the riverbank. A heron wades silently focused as a monk. You nod to it. It ignores you. Birds are like that. Your spouse arrives with bread and cheese and a jug of thin ale. You share it on a blanket spread over a dry patch of earth. The cheese is sharp. The bread is warm. A bee tries to land on your cup. You welcome it, then gently blow it away. You respect each other's work. After lunch, you check the orchard. The trees hum with new growth, their branches twitching, with the promise of pears and plums if the weather holds and the goats behave. You mark the weeds to be pulled tomorrow. There are always more weeds. It's their main talent. Nearby, someone sings while scything grass. The tune rises and falls like breath, like a lullaby for the soil. You recognize it. It's about a farmer who married a fairy and lost his pitchfork to a rainbow. A true story depending on who tells it. You return home sore but content. Your hands smell of thyme and loam. Your boots squelch. Your child carries a worm with solemn reverence. It's now their pet. Its name is Turnip the Brave. That evening you sit by the hearth and tally the planted rows. Not on parchment, just in your head like your mother did. You hum the song of the fairy farmer under your breath. Your spouse spins flax in the corner, foot tapping to the beat. And the fire crackles like soil warming in spring. Because this is more than planting. It's memory. It's patience. It's the quiet power of coaxing life from cold earth, season after season, until the land forgets how to be stingy. You go to sleep that night with sore shoulders, aching knees, and the peaceful weight of mud under your nails. The fields are silent now, but they dream in green. The child is screaming again. Not yours this time, thankfully, but the baker's red-faced and indignant, clutching a slate tablet and declaring war on the Latin verb esse. You sip your watered ale from the corner of the chapel schoolroom and pretend not to smirk. Brother Ked sighs, rubs his temples, and attempts once more to explain the difference between I am and you are without losing his remaining grip on inner peace. It's education day, which in this case is every day the sun isn't actively trying to drown the village. You watch as a group of children wrestles the alphabet like it owes them a debt. Some scratch letters into wax tablets, others onto bits of bark or the smoothest stones they could find. One child is trying to spell their name with actual pebbles. Said doesn't stop them. Creativity counts. You remember your own lessons. Long ago, in this same room, you recited Latin declensions while trying not to drop your charcoal or fall asleep at the grammar scroll. You once conjugated to be with such enthusiasm you fell off your bench. The memory still stings, and so does your left knee when it rains. And yet you kept coming. Because in this world, knowledge isn't easy. It's hunted, hoarded, and handed down in crooked lines and muddy boots. And if you're lucky enough to learn, you hold it like a candle on a windy hill. Today's lesson moves on to copying. The children dip quills into thin ink, made from crushed berries or ash mixed with goat's milk, whatever's available, and unlikely to be drunk by mistake. One writes their name with all the letters backwards. Another adds a drawing of a smiling worm next to the Lord's Prayer. Said pretends not to notice, too. And then comes the part everyone dreads reading aloud. The baker's daughter steps forward and recites a psalm, haltingly but clear. The rest follow, some mumbling, some muttering, one just humming along in hope of escape. You clap softly at the end. It matters. Historians still argue how widespread literacy was in early medieval Europe. Some say only the clergy read. Others point to Will's charms, riddles etched into combs, and graffiti on church walls that says otherwise. You lean toward the latter. You've seen villagers sign their names with shaky pride. Heard songs passed down in precise couplets never written, but never lost. Watched your spouse calculate a barter with mental math and a frown that could curdle cream. And just last week, your neighbor's boy scratched a message onto your door with a stick, "You are goat escaped." Helpful, honest, and mostly spelled right. You visit the scriptorium after the lesson. Said shows you a student's copybook full of misshapen letters, doodles of geese, and a heartfelt poem about bread. "She's 8, he says. Already better than me. You believe it. You help tidy the desks, straighten the reeds, clean the ink pots. Then you notice it tucked under a bench wrapped in linen marked with a wax seal. A grammar book, in Old English. Your mouth opens slightly. Said shrugs. Not everyone speaks Latin, he says. Might as well teach what people understand. The book is handwritten carefully, a mix of rules, rhymes, and riddles. One page simply says, to teach a child, first listen to their questions. You close it with reverence. On your way home, you pass a girl scratching letters in the dust with a stick. Her brother watches, trying to copy. A goat walks by unimpressed. You stop, kneel, and correct his B. He beams. You pretend your heart doesn't. Back in your hut, you unwrap your old slate. Scratch a few words into its dusty surface. Your name, your child's. A line from that poem about bread. You show it to them that evening. They ask what it says. You tell them. They ask what it means. You say everything. Because here education doesn't come in scrolls and stone towers. It comes in whispered lessons, in half-memorized hymns, in the stubborn determination to know just a little more than yesterday. And in that, there's nothing dark at all. You're fixing a shoe when it starts. A low hum rising slowly like bees in a barrel, or the sound your cousin makes when contemplating second helpings. You pause, tilt your head, and realize it's coming from the market lane. You peek out. A parade. Well, not quite. More of a slightly enthusiastic walk with flags a-drum and a very proud man holding aloft what appears to be a sandal on a stick. The Cobblers Guild has arrived. Today is Guild Day in town, a celebration, a meeting, and unofficially a competition to see which trade can be the loudest, best fed, and least likely to set something on fire. You throw on your cloak and follow. The square is already bustling. Carpenters showing off joinery so intricate you'd need divine intervention to dust it. Dyers waving swatches of blue so bright they make your eyes itch. Bakers carrying trays of intricately twisted bread that look more decorative than digestible. And in the middle of it all, the cobblers. Their booth boasts shoes, sandals, and one ambitious creation that may actually be a hat. You approach respectfully. They're joined by the Weavers Guild, who are pointedly not talking to the Tanners Guild after last year's dispute over hide quality and a suspiciously lopsided purse. Each guild flies its own banner. Each banner is a masterpiece, or at least memorable. You spot the blacksmith's flag, an anvil, a hammer, and a very muscular pig for reasons that go unspoken. Your friend Oswin waves you over. He's a brewer now. His guild is offering samples. You accept one. It's fizzy, slightly herbal, tastes like bread that wanted to be wine and gave up halfway through. You nod solemnly and say, "Excellent," he beams. Guilds here are serious business. Not just about trade, but about trust training, and occasionally very dramatic arguments over shoe widths. A young apprentice stands nearby demonstrating stitching technique on a piece of leather. She's nervous. Her mentor watches with arms crossed and eyebrows raised. The stitch is crooked. She sighs. Starts again. This time it's straight. He nods. She beams. You clap. Historians still argue whether medieval guilds protected workers or simply regulated them into boredom. You've seen both. But you've also seen the way a guild will rally behind one of their own, when illness strikes, when fire takes a workshop, when a rival tradesman tries to undercut the price of barrels. Guilds remember. They know who taught who messed up that one commission, who made the shoes that never wore out and the ones that did dramatically in church. You recall a winter when the Coopers made too many buckets. Instead of selling them, they stacked them into a tower, declared it a monument to efficiency, and held meetings inside it. You attended one. The acoustics were terrible. Today, though, there's a shared spirit. Rivalries are paused. Pies are shared. Someone sings. The glassblowers harmonize badly but with feeling. And the town clerk gives a speech full of long words and small applause. No one listens closely. The blacksmiths are starting a rhythmic chant with their hammers. You wander between stalls admiring work combs carved from bone candles shaped like saints, a lock so complicated its maker can't open it without whispering to it first. You overhear a child asking how to join a guild. Patience, says the weaver, and good eyesight. Bribery, says the baker. Cake, adds the child. Everyone agrees. Back at the cobbler's booth, someone has indeed made a hat out of sandals. It's been placed on the town goose. The goose does not protest. This is somehow a win. You return home with a half loaf of twisted bread, a pamphlet about shoe maintenance written in rhyme, and a small brass token stamped with the guild symbol, a boot, a thimble, and a smiley face that may be unintentional. And as you settle by the hearth that night, you look at your own tools, worn familiar, dependable. You think about the guilds with their rules and roles and rivalries, and you feel it. That sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than your task. A thread in a net, a stitch in a shared shoe, and that too keeps you warm. You wake with a throb behind your eye and the distinct sensation that your tooth is plotting against you. Not the molar? No, that one gave up 2 winters ago and now just sulks quietly. It's the front one. The one that's been threatening rebellion since you bit into that very ambitious walnut. You sit up slowly, test your jaw, and sigh. It's time to visit the healer again. You make your way across the village jaw, clutched like a treasure. You'd rather return past the sheep, who always look like they know something, and the chicken that definitely does. The healer greets you at the door with a look that says she already knows why you're here. Too hard a biscuit, she asks, ushering you inside. Walnut, you mutter. She tuts sympathetically and gestures to the stool. She examines your tooth with a twig, a squint, and a sniff. Inflamed, she declares, and sulking. You nod. I can feel the sulk. She sets to work muttering in Old English Latin and something you think is just creative swearing. She pulls a pot from the shelf, dips her finger in a dark, sticky salve, and smears it across your gums. It tastes like regret and burnt time. Clove oil willow bark, touch of blessed honey, she explains, and a smidge of saint's water. You raise an eyebrow. She shrugs. Rainwater collected on St. Mildred's feast day has opinions. You lean back as she packs a cloth with ground fennel and tells you to bite gently and pray harder. You can't help but marvel this is medicine in your world. Not sterile, not standardized, but layered with meaning, crafted with care, and not without a little magic. Historians still argue whether medieval medicine was effective or just superstitious pageantry. They rarely sit in the chair. You've seen it work. When your child had a fever, it was this healer who brewed a tea from elderflower, and Yarrow wrapped them in damp linens and whispered an old rhyme while the fever broke. When your spouse twisted their ankle, she bound it with mugwort and wool, and made them laugh until the pain gave up out of sheer exhaustion. And when the blacksmith got an infected thumb, she drained it with a hot iron and blessed it with a story about a saint who once healed a knight using only a boiled leek and sheer defiance. You've also read the official medical text said keeps hidden in the chapel. It lists remedies in precise scribbled Latin deer fat, for swelling nettle tea, for lethargy crushed pearl, if you're very rich and very unlucky. But right next to it are notes in the margins. Only use if patient doesn't bite. Add honey or no one drinks this twice. Remind Oswin you're a healer, not a magician. You think of the herbs drying in your rafters at home? Sage lavender mint. The emergency garlic clove no one is allowed to touch. You think of the charm your neighbor carries woven from flaxbone and something she won't name, but claims keeps bad moods and badgers away. You think of Saint Apollonia, patron of teeth, whose icon hangs by the healer's fire, and who is often consulted in cases like yours with both reverence and an occasional threat. You rinse your mouth with salted vinegar. You don't cry. Much. And when you leave, she hands you a wrapped parcel. For chewing, she says, when the pain quiets. Licorice root ginger bark, and a boiled sweet if you behave. You do. Because here medicine is part care, part craft, and part community theater. It's the tea someone brings without asking. The footbath by the hearth. The whispered, you'll be fine when the salve stings and the goat won't stop staring. You go home, lie by the fire, and feel the pain shift from sharp to dull to tolerable. You chew the root slowly. It tastes like earth and something kind. And you smile carefully. Because in this world, healing is never just science. It's story, touch, and time. And it works. Mostly, the road stretches out before you like a promise you didn't make, but find yourself keeping anyway. You've packed light bread, dried fruit, a charm tied in wool, and a tin flask of water blessed by Brother Said, and suspiciously also tasted by the goat. You wear your best cloak, your second best shoes, and the look of someone not entirely sure why they agreed to this. You're going on pilgrimage. Not to a holy relic or cathedral this time, though those are real revered and sometimes surprisingly damp, but to the shrine of Saint Dunwine, patron of lost objects, accidental miracles, and people who fall into rivers. It's a 3-day journey, maybe 4 if the weather sulks. You set off just after dawn, waved off by your neighbor who's slipped a note into your pack that simply reads, "Bring back a pebble." You nod solemnly. The right pebble is essential. The road is more of a suggestion than a path. You pass farmsteads, their windows blinking at the light. Fields where oxen shuffle like old men. A boy chasing a chicken with a shoe. None of this is unusual. Mid-morning you meet another pilgrim. He carries a staff, wears a broad hat, and speaks with a lisp that suggests 3 missing teeth and 1 too many opinions about saints. He tells you tales of visions in puddles relics that glow, and a man who saw heaven after eating a questionable mushroom. You nod along, unsure if he's blessed or simply well-fed. That evening you reach a small village. You stay in the guest barn, sharing space with 2 monks, a barrel of pickled onions, and a cat named Pilgrim, who absolutely isn't, but has mastered the expression. Supper is stew, thick brown, slightly mysterious. You say grace, so does the cat. The monks sing a song before bed, soft lilting, barely touching the air. You fall asleep to the sound, thinking of the shrine, the pebble, and whether your child remembered to feed the sourdough starter. The next morning the road curves into woods. Here the silence deepens. Leaves whisper. Birds flit. A fox watches you pass unimpressed but curious. You whisper back. It seems polite. You pass a crossroads marked by stones stacked in uneven pyramids, offerings from other pilgrims. You add yours a ribbon, a coin, a piece of cheese. The cheese is accepted by a passing raven. You feel blessed. Midday the road rises. You climb slowly, boots biting mud hard, thudding in rhythm with your breath. At the top of you, hills like sleeping beasts, fields like patchwork, a river gleaming like a thread in a saint's robe. You sit, eat bread, watch the sky drift by like it's lost and not particularly concerned about it. Historians still argue whether pilgrimage in the Dark Ages was always religious, or sometimes just a chance to see the next village without judgment. You suspect both. Because yes, people seek relics healing miracles, but they also seek space, perspective, a change from mud in one place to mud in another. By late afternoon, you reach the shrine. It's small. A stone arch, a wooden carving of Saint Dunwine, holding a lost sock probably symbolic, and a spring whose water tastes faintly of mint and mystery. You kneel. You pray. You whisper something half holy, half hopeful. Then you leave a token your spoon. The good one. The one carved during a snowstorm, smoothed by years of soup and silence. It feels right. You take a pebble and return flat, dark, shaped like a tear. It hums in your palm. On the way home, you walk slower. You pass new pilgrims, offer a smile, a warning about the stew, a hint where the fox might still be watching. You reach your village at dusk 2 days later. Your child runs to greet you, demands a story. You tell them about the shrine, the monk, the cheese-thieving raven. They listen wide-eyed, holding the pebble like treasure. That night you place it on the hearth. Not magic, not relic, but reminder that even in the dark, people wander. Not to escape, but to remember the light they carry. You're startled awake by a bang on the roof and the unmistakable sound of cursing from a man currently sliding off it. You rush outside to find Oswin tangled in your firewood stack, muttering about signs, omens, and something that may or may not involve a frog. What were you doing, you ask? He squints skyward. Forecasting, he says. Goosebone method. You help him up. He dusts himself off and with full sincerity adds, "There's a mild thunderstorm brewing in 3 days, probably before lunch." You blink. Because of a goosebone. He nods. Split clean. Warm to the touch. It never lies. Welcome to medieval meteorology. In your world, there's no weather channel, no barometric graphs, no polite app suggesting you carry an umbrella. What you do have are centuries of folklore observation and the sincere belief that animals' bones and certain vegetables are in constant conversation with the sky. Take your neighbor, for example. She swears that if the cabbage leaves curl inwards, frost is coming. If they curl outwards, company is. She adjusts her stew accordingly. You've heard farmers debate the shape of clouds as seriously as theology. Flat-bottomed dry spell, puffy tower storm, green-tinged sky duck, and prey. Then there's the saint's calendar. Everyone has it memorized whether they admit it or not. Rain on St. Swithin's Day means 40 days of weeping heavens. Saint Medard. If it rains, then your hay may never dry. But perhaps the most suspicious indicators of weather are the animals. You've seen cows cluster under trees long before thunder. Chickens flapping nervously when wind turns from the west. And cats are practically barometers. If yours starts washing behind its ears, you get out your second-best cloak. If it hides under the bed, you cancel plans and make soup. Historians still argue whether medieval weather lore was empirical observation or comforting nonsense. But you've lived here long enough to know that when three frogs jump east at sunrise, you don't hang your laundry. Today you help Oswin test his theory. He pulls out a parchment. On it, several drawings of bones clouds plant leaves and one extremely confident-looking duck. That one predicted last year's hail, he says, tapping the duck. You nod solemnly. He tosses a pine cone into the air. It landed open, he murmurs. Storm for sure. You glance at the sky. Clear. Blue. Peaceful. By supper, it's pouring. You and Oswin sit by the fire, slightly smug, watching the goat try to find shelter under a too small bench. You ever wrong, you ask. Once, he says, but I think the goose lied. After the rain, you step outside into the soft hush of drenched earth and satisfied roots. The garden already looks taller, the cabbage smug, and the air is filled with that rich smell of renewal of worm-turned soil and soot-washed leaves. You light a candle and whisper a thank you to the sky. You don't know if it hears, but it listens in its own way. The old woman down the lane says you can predict a storm by how loudly your joints complain. You believe her. Your knees screamed yesterday. Tonight you scratch the date on your wall in charcoal storm bones. Frogs correct. One more notch in the endless weather journal. Your village keeps not in books, but in memory and murmured wisdom. And when your child asks tomorrow how you knew you'll smile, point at the duck and say, experience. Because here weather isn't an inconvenience. It's a character. A force, an old friend with moods and messages, and if you listen close enough to the trees, the birds, and yes, the goose bones, it might just tell you what's coming next. It begins as these things often do with a question over onions. You're sitting by the hearth, slicing the last of the sweet ones, small, round, and slightly smug, when your child turns to you, eyes wide and voice serious. Why did the owl marry the fox? You pause. A reasonable question, really, but the answer, well, it requires context. You set the knife down, stir the pot, and clear your throat. Once you begin long before the goose was wise and the sheep knew sarcasm, the owl and the fox met in a riddle. The fire crackles, the shadows gather, the child listens. And just like that, another story is born. In your world, stories are breath. They live around fires over fences under eaves. They're not written, not always, though. Some are scratched into wax or etched into memory by repetition. Most simply pass from one tongue to another like a loaf of good bread, warm and slightly misshapen, but very satisfying. You've heard riddles with punchlines that make no sense and sense that needs no punchline. If you feed it, it grows. If you give it water, it dies. Answer fire. But you've also heard ones that make you pause. What has roots as nobody sees is taller than trees? Up it goes and yet never grows. The answer is mountain. But the silence afterward always feels bigger. Today after supper, the village gathers not for judgment or harvest, or even singing, but for stories. A ritual older than most roofs. Children sit on laps. Elders lean on staves. The dog curls in a place it shouldn't and dares anyone to move it. And the first tale begins. It's Oswin, of course. He tells of a knight who tried to court a tree. The tree refused politely, then turned him into a mushroom. Laughter ripples like wind in tall grass. Next, the baker tells a riddle. I have a heart that doesn't beat a bed, but never sleep. What am I? Your child whispers a river. You beam. Then it's your turn. You clear your throat and begin. Once a farmer found a stone that sang, you forget half the middle. Make up a squirrel with a lute. End with the stone becoming the first bell. Everyone claps. Someone passes bread. And the dog sighs in agreement. Historians still argue how widespread oral storytelling was in the so-called Dark Ages. How much lore was kept alive without ink, without parchment? You'd argue all of it. Because you've seen people weep at the tale of the fisherman who turned into a fish and then forgot how to fish. You've seen a baby calm at the sound of a lullaby that rhymes star with jar of pickles. You've watched 3 generations argue about whether the fox who stole the moon did it for love or just for light. The stories shift each time. grow new legs, new endings. Sometimes the fox is clever, sometimes he's clumsy, sometimes he marries the owl, sometimes he just borrows her umbrella. And through it all, the fire crackles, the night deepens, and your world softens. Because this is how truth is shared here, not in proclamations or decrees, but in tales told gently, repeated lovingly, and carried like breadcrumbs through the forest of the years. Tonight you return home with smoke in your cloak and a new riddle. What has no beginning, no end, and lives wherever it's told? Answer: a story. You tuck your child in. Whisper the owl's wedding tale again. They fall asleep before the end. You don't mind. The fox knows how to wait. You've stayed up late tonight, later than usual, scribbling letters by firelight with a bit of charcoal and a scrap of parchment you definitely weren't supposed to take from the chapel's waste pile. The fire is low, the coals glow like buried treasure, and your fingers are smudged with effort and hope. You're writing it down. Not just a list or a prayer, but your story. Your day. The way the air smelled after the storm, how the turnip stew came out better than expected, and the fact that the goat once again found a way onto the roof. It's not poetry. It might not even be grammatically correct, but it's yours. You set the parchment aside, let the ink or what passes for it dry, and stretch your back. Your child stirs in sleep, murmuring something about a dancing chicken. You smile and add that to the list. You're not alone in this. People are writing everywhere. A monk in the next village chronicles rainfall with obsessive dedication, noting how many worms emerge per puddle. A shepherd, you know, keeps a tally of dream symbols, strange animals, things whispered by the wind. They believe it'll help predict winter. Honestly, they might be right. And Brother said, he writes letters to no one in particular, addressing them to the saints who might be listening. He stores them in a wooden box. Once he let you read one, it was about moss, very detailed, surprisingly moving. Historians still argue whether the written word in this age was exclusive elite locked away in scriptoria and chained to the shelves of noble halls. But you've seen the notes scratched into door frames, the charms written on leather scraps and tucked into sleeves, the initials carved into beamstones and once the side of the stew pot. People are writing, not for fame, not for power, but to remember, to witness, to whisper to the future, I was here. And I had thoughts about onions. You recall the tale of a merchant who kept a ledger with more drawings than numbers. Each item he sold had a symbol, a shoe, a fish, a grumpy-looking sheep. His records were flawless, his sheep iconic. There's a woman in the hills who writes poetry, soft slanted lines about cloud's loss, and the way cheese ages like secrets. She recites them aloud while she spins, letting the wind carry her rhymes across the valley. And somewhere surely someone is composing an epic, not about kings or war, but about a very persistent pig and a festival that went delightfully sideways. Tonight your writing is simple. No one will sing it. No one will copy it in gold. But it matters, because in it you catch a glimpse of yourself, muddy, tired, but smiling. A soul caught mid-step on the winding path of days. You fold the parchment, slip it beneath the basket where you keep your thread and herbs, and whisper a tiny blessing. Be found. You bank the fire, nudge the goat off your sleeping mat, and stretch out under the thick wool blanket that smells faintly of lavender and soup. Outside the stars blink like candle flames, too far to warm you, but close enough to notice. And you think someone will read this, maybe? Or maybe not. Maybe it'll crumble or burn or be used one day to wrap cheese. But tonight it's here. It's real. And so are you. So sleep, storyteller, chronicler, ink-stained dreamer with crumbs on your tunic and a smudge on your nose. You've written. You've remembered. And that's enough. The wind is gentle tonight, brushing over the thatched rooftops, like a mother smoothing back a child's hair. You hear it as you step outside, low and even whispering across the fields, rustling the last of the dried leaves like parchment pages being slowly turned by invisible fingers. You take a walk. Not far. just to the edge of the village where the path fades into meadow and the trees cluster like old sentinels. The stars above are generous tonight, scattered wide and wild across the sky, as if someone knocked over a jar of light and let it spill. You walk slowly. Each step presses softly into the earth, damp from yesterday's storm, but still firm enough to hold you. The smell of turned soil clings to the air, warm, rich, and slightly mushroomy. The kind of scent that tells you the land is still breathing even in its sleep. You pause at the gate to the sheepfold. The animals are calm, curled into themselves, their warmth rising like a blessing into the cool night. One lifts its head and gives you a look of mild disapproval, then tucks back down without fuss. You take that as encouragement. The village is quiet now. The fire's banked. The story's told. The bread rising under cloth. And you, just one soul among many wrapped in wool and moonlight, feel the weight of the world settle not as a burden, but as a blanket. This age, this so-called dark age, has been lit in its own strange ways. By hearths and hearts. By prayers scrawled in corners and lullabies hummed without words. By hands that build and bind that stitch cloaks and copy verses that plant onions and pick up quills. The darkness never was empty. It was simply shadowed, softened by time, cloaked in mystery, waiting for someone to sit beside it and listen. And tonight you've done just that. You've walked its paths, tasted its stew, met its saints, scribes, tricksters, and toothaches. You've wandered from hearth to chapel, from field to forge, from riddle to rhyme. And now, with stars overhead and soil underfoot, you find yourself full not just with facts or tales, but with something gentler, a kind of knowing, a kind of peace. Because the past doesn't whisper in thunder. It hums. It sighs. It leans in close and says, I was here. I mattered. And now you do too. You turn back toward home, your cloak heavy with dew, your mind soft as butter in the morning sun. Inside, the goat's already stolen your spot. You smile. Let it. You pull a blanket onto the bench, stretch, close your eyes, and let the hush of history hold you. Let your breath slow now. Let your shoulders sink just a little deeper into your blanket. Let your fingers unclench your jaw, soften your feet, rest heavy and warm. You've walked a long road tonight. Not through war or battle, but through candlelight and kitchen doors. Through stories told softly over stew. Through the murmured names carved into beams, etched into prayer, stitched into memory. The world you've wandered wasn't so dark after all. It had color, earthy browns, sky blue, smoky gold. It had sound, quiet laughter quills on parchment goats in places they absolutely shouldn't be. It had warmth. Not the fire kind always, but the kind that lives in shared bread and borrowed songs and riddle whispers, passed down by generations who never forgot how to hope. Tonight the past has curled beside you, not loud, not proud, but present, telling you the world has always made do, and so have you. Let your thoughts drift now like smoke from a dying fire. Let them rise, flicker, fade. You're safe. You're home. And you are exactly where you need to be. Sleep well, wanderer. Dream gently, listener. I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night.